Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. It's difficult to be optimistic about liberalism's future, certainly in the short to medium term. We're in an acute period of democratic backsliding and authoritarian ascendency. The opposition party, or at least its leadership, has been largely supine in response. A backlash is rising, but it's an open question whether it'll be enough and soon enough to make a difference. But it's also not a time to give up all hope. There is a backlash. The current regime is deeply unpopular, and a ton of Americans and people around the world watching what's happening to America are rediscovering the value of liberal principles and values. My guest today is Andy Craig, a fellow in liberalism at the Institute for Humane Studies. We discuss the blitzkrieg of lawlessness in the first 6 months of the new Trump administration and why so many Democratic lawmakers have failed to respond to it with seriousness and urgency. But we also talk about the way forward and how liberalism, true and radical liberalism, can chart that course. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported show. If you'd like to listen to episodes uninterrupted by ads from our sponsors, you can join my Patreon. Look for the link in the show notes to learn more. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Andy. We scheduled this recording some time ago, and as I was prepping for it, the news came down. We're recording this on July 3rd at, what would it be, 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Just a few hours ago, the House passed Trump's budget and domestic policy bill along basically party lines. And it really brought into focus how the degree to which the Democrats are basically failing in this moment. Every single one of them voted against this bill, but the seriousness of the situation contrasted with the either supine nature of their response or the purely performative nature of their response and the unwillingness to use all the levers that they do have, even as a minority party, to at least muck things up, throw grit in the gears, slow things down, whatever. What's going on there? I mean, this seems like the moment that everyone's been warning about. The rise of American fascism, it can happen here. All our fears about Trump, all of the warnings that the Democrats gave throughout the election, Biden's, dramatically lit campaign speech about the threat that Trump represented, and yet the response has been so overwhelmingly milquetoast. What's happening?
Well, there are a few different things going on that I think are getting us to that dynamic. The first and kind of most obvious is that the congressional leadership in both houses, but I think you particularly see it in Schumer on the Senate side. They're stuck in yesterday's world. They are not really able to update their priors about how we are now playing a radically different game from what they have known their entire careers, which is, you go out, you make your attacks, you use your talking points, and then you hope to whittle away at them and win the next election. And you kind of ride the waves of thermostatic backlash. I mean, that's been the politics they have known, that, all of us have really seen for, going back decades, at least to the post-civil rights kind of era, where, one party gets a turn, the other party gets a turn. And so they are not coming to terms with how the institutions are not collapsing. They have collapsed. We are no longer meaningfully operating under a constitutional government. Camps are being built. People are being disappeared. Dissent is being suppressed and attacked. Um, the kleptocracy and the bribery is all out in the open, and that's not something you can effectively fight by going out and getting your zingers and doing your speeches and doing your usual little song and dance of normal democratic, lowercase d democratic politics. Um, and it undercuts them in a really big way because exactly what you hit on, like they were, and to a substantial degree still are. They will talk about how it's a constitutional crisis, and they will say that, but then their actions contradict it. They are not acting like it. I mean, I think a big turning point for how we got here was Schumer, and he rallied enough votes to get it passing the government funding bill because, a shutdown would be worse. Um, and that gave everything that's happened since is happening on funding that literally Chuck Schumer voted for. And that's the fundamental power a legislature has in the kind of Anglo-American constitutional system, to check a runaway executive. I mean, this is the fight that ended with Charles I being beheaded. And they gave up on it. They have aggressively whipped hard against any talk of impeachment. And that's a similar dynamic where, they don't have the votes. They don't have the votes to do anything, in the sense of ultimately passing something. They certainly don't have the votes to override a veto. But you can't describe the gravity of the situation and the scale of this crime spree going on and then shy away from, he must be removed from office. He must be removed from power. And in a similar way, there's been a lot of frustration from people, rightly so, because, I mean, for one thing, they don't even consistently vote against, you can see dozens of votes for nominees, less so for the cabinet positions, but some of those, I mean, Marco Rubio was unanimously confirmed. You still see coming through all the, sub-cabinet nominees coming through. A lot of them will still get Democratic votes. But also they're refusing to use the procedural tools they do have, particularly in the Senate, but this is true in the House too. There's a lot of things you could do. If you're determined to treat this as a real crisis, there are rules, there are procedures. You could grind Congress to a halt. And they've refused to do that. And they've been so patronizing because there are a lot of people, maybe not the mass of the general public, but what we might call high info voters, people who are really paying attention, the kind of core activists and people kind of adjacent to that sort of thing know this. Like, it's been getting a lot of talk. And when they respond to it, they're so arrogant and patronizing about, you don't, a pat on the head, you don't know how the game's really played. That's not how it works. And the combination of it is why, even with Trump's approvals falling and, congressional Republicans are unpopular, Trump's underwater, congressional Democratic leadership polls like they're George W. Bush in 2008. They are, obviously Republicans don't like them, but independents don't like them, and their own base doesn't like them. And they are in a huge bubble where it is not getting through to them that they are loathed. They're seen as collaborators. I mean, Vichy Democrats is the label applied to them, and it's justified.
You call it a bubble, but that seems, I don't know, difficult to believe that they could be in that much of a bubble, because the polling data is so clear on this. The anger is so clear. We saw, both of you and I hang out on Blue Sky, and congressional Democrats show up on there, and was reporting a month, 2 months ago about congressional Democrats like not wanting to hang out on Blue Sky because they're getting yelled at so much by its, progressive leaning audience. I understand that they are in, they're talking with their peers primarily. They're talking then within the bubble that is Washington, but it just seems hard to believe that they can be unaware of the anger that is directed at them, the dislike that's directed at them, and this sense, as you said, of them, like everybody sees them as not just failing, but as collaborating in this project to destroy American democracy. Like, is this intentional? Is it that they fundamentally just don't believe that anyone who's not one of them can have a valid opinion? Do they see what they're doing as something other than it is? Like, do they genuinely believe that they are fighting back to the greatest extent? Like, it just seems implausible that they just are unaware of all of this.
Well, there's a couple of things going on there. One is, they do believe they are fighting back in what they think is the most effective way possible. And that goes to their, they can't update their priors about the different world we're in. These are, to a degree, it's the gerontocracy that we talk about, particularly on the Democratic side. I mean, right now they were down 3 votes in the House because 3 of them died in office because they keep running these, to put it bluntly, geriatric cancer patients for reelection. But that shows up in kind of the minds of they're just out of touch. The other thing is, so you mentioned blue sky, and I think that this is actually a big part of it. So I'm a happy blue sky user. I'm probably on the 95th percentile of the right flank of blue sky. As a, Trump hating libertarian or whatever we call ourselves these days. But it's easy to dismiss that as, oh, that's just the the noisy online base. That's what we once would have been Twitter. Ignore that, shrug it off. That's not the real world. And the reason, one, that's not true anymore. Social media is the real world now. More people, obviously not blue sky in particular, but social media writ large is a bigger news source for people than legacy outlets now. We saw that recently. It actually finally crossed over in terms of which was the bigger total, according to one study. They also misread polls in ways that the Democratic kind of the consultant class, the DC, what we think of as kind of the Hill bubble, because they see correctly that they're likely to flip the House in the midterms. They're not up by 10 points, like 20 points, like they should be under the circumstances, but they're up by 1, 2, 3 points on the generic ballot. There's the usual midterm dynamics we're all used to, the thermostatic backlash. And so to play devil's advocate, their theory of it is we need to kind of keep our heads down and not rock the boat and not be so alienating. And we need the backlash against Republicans to be the focus. And then we're just kind of, we're the only alternative. And this comes about from so long the uncompetitive nature of our system. We talk about incumbents fearing primaries more than general elections, and that's true. But the fact is they don't have much reason to fear either. The numbers are tiny. What gets considered a bloodbath in the primaries is a single-digit number of members being defeated. If you're an incumbent member of Congress, 90% plus, the seat is yours for as long as you want it. And so it has broken that feedback loop. And that seeps into mindsets in a way that, these are not dumb people for the most part. There are some dumb members of Congress, but for the most part, these are smart people who are just dealing with a framework for viewing the world and understanding the ebb and flow of politics that doesn't work anymore. And so when they see those, they do see those poll numbers of, oh, their approval ratings are terrible and that kind of thing. But they have for so long kind of been trained to shrug that off as irrelevant, because it has been for the most part, for their ability to kind of keep and maintain their power and their role and their, their back and forth time when they're eventually in the majority and all that. Um, but they're not, I mean, we're already seeing ginned up charges against members of Congress. I mean, we're seeing talk of with Zoran in New York, who's obviously not in Congress, but like they're talking about denaturalizing him and stripping his citizenship and that kind of thing. Like these things are going to be escalating, and particularly now after this bill. I mean, we can maybe touch on this a little bit, but like I don't think Democrats realize the scale of what just passed and what is now coming in terms of the massive exponential increase in ICE and what that is going to mean and what it's going to be used for. I mean, they're still playing from the old playbook of, this is tax cuts for the billionaires and they're cutting Medicaid. And that's all true. And I mean, it's not wrong. There's hay to be made there in making those arguments politically, whatever we might think ideal policy wise. Obviously we're not standard issue progressives on those kinds of things, but they think that's the playbook. That's the old well to go back to because that's all they know. And attacking the radicalness of what's actually happening and what's coming down the pike requires language they just don't speak. They don't know it. I mean, it's like asking somebody to get up and speak a language they don't know. And so that's why ultimately, like, I don't think there's no fix to this that's not turnover, that's not getting new people and their new leaders. And that, that after all this, there was a fair amount of ineptitude with Schumer throughout the entirety of the Trump era before this. The Democratic senators reelected him unopposed is just indefensible. And that's why I think another part of the dynamic is they know they're all on the hook. There's very little room there's nobody who hasn't dabbled their fingers in the blood, so to speak. It's very hard for any of them to come out and credibly say, no, I'm the insurgent opponent now of all that, at least in terms of people who are there and certainly in the Senate, and there's not many of them and they don't have much standing in the House. So yeah, I think all of that is kind of coming together where you get this just weak, and it comes across as fake. Everybody knows it's fake. I'm standing up for middle-class working families, yada, yada, yada. Like that same talking points we've all heard from Democrats our entire lives, which, you might agree or disagree with it, but it doesn't sound any different. It's like it comes across like this is my focus group poll tested consultant spoon fed talking points. And there's no authenticity to it. There's no fight behind it. And that just doesn't work.
Can the anger we're seeing from basically everybody outside of Congress, so all of the base, the voters, younger voters, there was data about like youth turnout for Mamdani, and it was extraordinary in terms of how much he energized the youth vote. I've seen similar stuff about like young Democrats are feeling really energized right now to affect change. We've seen, like the No Kings protests, which were huge and showed up in, places where you would not expect to see significantly sized protests, like towns throughout the red South and so on. Do you think that I guess one way to ask this is, do you think that they are right, that they can just keep their heads down? They won't really get hurt much in the primaries. The backlash against Trump will carry them to victory in the House. Or do you think that they are going to see something more than a single digit bloodbath, that there will actually be energy to kick a lot of these people out and elevate the few who are fighting or the outsiders who want to stand up?
I think it will be more than they're expecting, but it also will not be the massive degree of turnover people optimistically expect. You might see 10 or 20 potentially lose their seats in primaries, or they bow out because they know they're going to face a strong primary challenge. Like that happens. Like Dick Durbin, who's 80 bajillion years old, finally agreed to just not run for another term. So there'll be some of those, which basically count in the same bucket. But um, the structural advantages of our electoral system for incumbency are so massive, even when there is this huge wave of backlash against them. Um, I suspect what's going to happen, what we already see happening, is not that there will be enough new fight hard Democrats. It will get better. It'll improve. There will be new people who come in who bring some of that energy, and they will move the needle. But I don't think. I mean, I don't think we'll see a turnover in who the leadership is. Jeffries will still be there. Almost certainly Schumer will still be the leader in the Senate, and their retinue. But what you will see is a movement of energy and focus away from Congress because it's become such an ineffective and useless arena for fighting back and resistance, and moving to the states, the governors. I mean, I think it's a really stark contrast how many governors have been doing the opposite. They have been catching the moment. People I'm not necessarily a huge fan of, like Gavin Newsom, um, and others. I mean, Pritzker in Illinois. We've seen it in Janet Mills in Maine. And part of that is structural. They have tools and mechanisms. The Democratic attorneys general, the state attorneys general fighting back in the courts have been really aggressive and have clocked some wins. And so I think you'll see that. And aside from that, it's going to be the civil society resistance. It's going to be the orgs that fight back against being targeted. I mean, it's weird to think about the president of Harvard as an insurgent resistance hero, but it's going to be things like that. It will be organizations, civil societies, businesses who are pushed and pushed and pushed to their breaking point and start fighting back. And so that's kind of my optimistic take of it. Is I don't think Congress gets better during this presidential term. Even if the House flips and there's a narrow Democratic majority. I mean, even if they, let's be honest. Even if they take the House, the Senate map is very unfavorable to them. That's why most people, and including me, are kind of discounting the idea of flipping the Senate. But let's say they take the House. That's still the House against the Senate and the White House, and they can't pass anything that'll get through, and so there are things they could do, and they won't do enough with what they could do, but it is still limited. I think there really needs to be an increased focus on forcing the confrontations. I mean, when you're talking about how do you win a constitutional crisis, all the examples we have to consider in the United States and abroad, a huge part of it is making the conflict legible and forcing the confrontations. And that is going to happen both by deliberate will, but also just kind of the confluence of structural factors that force people into it. I think we're going to see that coming from the states, from civil society, from protests. And that's where the energy is going to be, particularly as we get into this massive ramping up of what's going to be happening under this bill. I mean, we're going to have a combination secret police force and occupying army funded to the level of it's comparable to like the entire Russian military. Like it's going to be ICE now is going to be bigger than all of federal law enforcement combined It's a military scale operation that's coming down the pike that's going to make what we've seen so far look like nothing. And that will generate popular backlash. I mean, the No Kings protest, as massive as that was, is not going to be the end of it. And the EU abusing and pressing the military to the breaking point is a fair likelihood of that we're going to get to a point where, National Guard adjutant general in a state refuses an order or something like that. And so those are the kinds of confrontations in which Democratic leaders in Congress are just going to be relegated to the sidelines as irrelevant, as I think we're largely already seeing. I mean, they're the target of hate, and at some point people just move on from even bothering to hate them because they're just irrelevant. And that's what they're consigning themselves to, even if they get what they think is the big win of, hey, we won back the House in the midterms.
Where does liberalism fit into all of this? Because we, as Americans, we tend to think of the Democratic Party as the embodiment of liberalism, the Republican Party as the embodiment of conservatism. Both have really broken down. There's nothing conservative about the GOP right now. It's a radical far-right extremist group that's not conservatism. That to the extent that liberalism is tied to the contemporary Democratic Party, that pretty heavily tarnishes it. It's a terrifying time for liberalism and to be a liberal, to watch the country going down the road that it is. Much of the self-consciously or self-identified like liberal movement is seeing people peeled off in various directions. You have a resurgence of, we can quibble about how broad we want to define liberalism, but my frequent guest, Matt McManus, would say like the socialists are very much within the liberal coalition, and others of us might disagree with him on that. But, we're seeing on the left, a lot of the energy is from people like AOC or Mamdani or people who are much more, wouldn't even call themselves liberals so much as like they would call themselves democratic socialists or something of the sort. It's a fraught and destabilized and complex environment. And so within this, I guess the question is, do you see opportunities for liberalism, opportunities for liberals, or just how, as liberals, who I imagine most of the people listening to this would call themselves, or at least think of themselves as liberal adjacent, how we should think about those pitfalls and those opportunities right now?
Well, there are kind of three options or three camps, I think, here. And so in turn, one of them is what we might call the technocratic, centrist, discredited old Democratic Party. And that's basically who we've been talking about so far. And then on the left, there are, this is a big complicated ball of wax. We call them social, because they often call themselves socialists in ways that I think is unhelpful. Like, I'll be honest, I don't think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez actually is a socialist. I think Bernie Sanders was. Bernie Sanders was at heart an old school Marxist crank. AOC is not. AOC is basically a normie progressive, left liberal progressive. But they're tarred with that, and they are still pulled in counterproductive policy directions because of it. In what, Zoran, for one thing, not everybody has the benefit of running against Andrew Cuomo. But also, of course, that's New York. That's not, what's going to flip Ohio and North Carolina and Arizona. And it's also in its own way, it's stagnant and old. Like, they're at their most energetic when they are sounding like what we call kind of the third option here, which is radical liberalism. And I think the No Kings protest was very heartening on that. So there was a lot of, it had a kind of lot of usual left energy, anti-billionaire talking points, which, I think a lot of liberals would, for slightly different reasons, agree with a lot of the, complaints about our current billionaire class, and that they're not entirely the product of free markets for sure. Um, but this was not like Occupy Wall Street. This was people out waving American flags, quoting the Declaration of Independence. This is a There are still deep liberal roots to American civic identity and history that are being called upon, that people are in some ways kind of stumbling towards and not necessarily super conscious, but that's where you end up. Um, if you're talking about the uncompromising radical opposition to uh, the national conservative far right, MAGA, Trumpism, whatever you call it, uh, that inevitably comes to be couched in classical terms. It can harken back to, and you see this more and more, um, the imagery and legacy of Lincoln and the Union in the Civil War, of the abolitionists fighting the Fugitive Slave Act. The echoes between the 1850s Fugitive Slave Act and what we are seeing and are going to see more of in the immigration, and to even call it immigration enforcement feels like granting the euphemism too much. But what's going on with that? Um, I think you're seeing a confluence there, and there's going to be liberalism not as the, decades past where we would use that as basically the equivalent to Democrat. Like you said, Democrats are liberals, Republicans are conservatives, and we basically use those terms interchangeably. That's not the case. And you're seeing a recognition, I think, from a lot of people, including a lot of people who are on the kind of pretty hard left, and some people who are traditional conservatives. The more never Trumper kind of crowd, recognizing that in forging this shared identity, liberalism, also lowercase r republicanism, which is a related thing in the history, but that was, no kings. that was the rallying cry of it. That was not kind of an empty rote patriotism of, oh yes, the Declaration in July 4th in 1776 and everything. That was calling upon the substance of what that history means and what those commitments are, and fighting dictatorship. There's a lot of power in that, and there's a lot of recognition that it's something broader and deeper than just a policy agenda. So, we certainly have our liberal policy preferences, and I could make my arguments for why a lot of those things fit in best with this kind of energy. But, as we're looking forward to the next year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years of this present crisis, I think that's going to be inevitably when the opposition has cast itself as authoritarianism, like full-blown mask-off autocracy, fascist to no small degree. The opposition becomes liberal, even if they're not people who are like in a stable, healthy European-style multi-party system. They wouldn't be in the liberal center-right, center-left party. They wouldn't be the Free Democrats or the Liberal Democrats in the UK or whatever, and that kind of particular bundle of policy agendas of socially liberal free markets, etc. But it's liberal in that deeper sense, in that they are on team liberal democracy, with lowercase l and a lowercase d. And I think there's a lot of that, and that's going to require a recognition, and this is already well along happening, that the opposition is not playing within the broad framework of we're all big tent, in a sense, liberals in America, which has been, the usual. Barry Goldwater and Martin Luther King, who disagreed strongly about things. We can read certainly have a more positive opinion one or the other, but they were recognizably right liberals and left liberals. And that kind of anchored the flanks of the American party system, what we would call the sixth party system, in the post-civil rights era through to, kind of the end of the pre-Trump era. And that allowed, as Hayek talked about, a kind of degrading and fading into the background of consciousness of it, of thinking about liberalism as a dividing line in politics, in a way that's, coming roaring back now. So that's my case for optimism, is I do think the opposition to Trump is not going to end up being socialist, in a real substantive way. And the people who are actually full-blown socialists are still a tiny fringe. There's just been this unfortunate trend where progressives on the left flank, as a kind of, it's the inverse of the own the libs mentality. It's like, that's what annoys the people I hate, so I'm going to call myself that. But we're not going to, nationalizing industries and all the rest of it is not the agenda and the message here. And at the same time, it's not going to be the kind of tepid centrism of, oh, can't we all get along? No labels, as it was infamously put by that group. The kind of, oh, well, it's polarization that's the real problem. And that's a complicated discussion. Polarization is part of how we got here. But I don't think it's going to be, it's not going to be, oh, let's have a grand revival of not liberalism, but centrism. That's not going to be it. And so kind of once you've eliminated that, and when you consider all these other dynamics that are feeding into it, I think it's already happening, and it's inevitable as the opposition to Trump radicalizes, which is happening and going to happen as Trump radicalizes, is going to be cast in fundamentally and recognizably big tent, broad church liberalism terms.
One of the aspects of this that really worries me is we are in, as what you're describing is a political realignment, and we are in a political realignment right now, and we're not going to go, you're correct, we're not going to go back to the old ways. So if Trump disappeared, the Trump administration went away tomorrow, we would not go back to the status quo of like the Obama administration or something. What worries me is the energy is very much right now among the progressive left. You're talking like the calls back to liberal principles are very much there, but the people who, it looks like the most energy, the most excitement is around people who are much more skeptical of markets, much less skeptical of government regulation, the kind of things on the economic liberty side of things that you and I care about, and care about not just because of property rights, not just because they create wealth, but also because they are genuinely among the most powerful tools we have for emancipation of the kind that like progressives and left liberals claim to value. Like markets free people from oppression and hierarchy much more so than they create oppression and hierarchy and so on. My worry is so many of the people who have historically been the most vocal supporters of free markets and limited intervention in the economy have been either wildly downplaying the threats of the Trump administration or have been finding ways to get on board with a lot of it. That there's been a splintering of that movement, and a lot of people have gone Trumpist in this incredibly frustrating way, because Trump represents the antithesis of what like the groups that we would have described as radical liberals had claimed to believe in. And my worry is that tarnishes, that what comes out of this is not liberalism, radical liberalism as you and I would define it, but essentially something that looks more like European social democracy which might be better in some ways than whatever the horrors that Trump and MAGA would like to inflict on both our economic and personal liberties. You mentioned like nationalizing industries. That seems like much more likely something that the GOP would push for at this point than the Democratic Party. So when I ask about like what liberals should do in this moment, maybe zooming in on us radical liberals, like how do we handle that? How do we handle making the case that a lot of what got us into this mess was government interventions into the economy, the housing market as a big one, or you mentioned the sorry class of at least some billionaires that we're witnessing are a lot of their wealth came not from the free market acting, but from taking advantage of state subsidies or anti-competition or whatever it happens to be. How do we make that case when people are like, look, you guys were talking this game for so long, and now I see you kind of lining up supporting Trump. It's the justices that you pushed for are the ones supporting his agenda and shielding him from correction. Like, what do we do there?
One aspect of that I think is cause for hope is that there is the, in a sense, positive side of negative polarization. We are seeing increasing recognition that, I mean, obviously most tariffs are the biggest example, where all of a sudden Democrats have warmed quite a lot to free trade. But for us, coming from our radical market liberalism / libertarian background, I think there needs to be an acceptance that we can work our way towards more market-friendly substance, but it's going to have to be cast in different language and different terms because of the degree to which that kind of language, and this is also true of like constitutional originalism and the founding fathers and invoking all that. Like, people are seeing and jaded by how much all that kind of language has become associated with exactly that, the lies of the American right that claim to believe in all those things and are now doing all the opposite. Trump is the most anti-free market president. Bracket everything else about the authoritarianism. He is the most anti-markets president we've had in, I don't know, post World War II, probably, maybe ever, arguably. And so it's going to involve a recasting of those commitments as market liberalism, as about the open society. And I think that already has a fair amount of purchase. And again, I think tariffs kind of point the way in that, and housing also points the way in that. So there was an interesting dynamic talking about the mayoral race in New York City. Zorab is coming in with a pretty old school basket of like, we're going to do rent freezes and we're going to have I hike the minimum wage and all that kind of thing. But there was already enough energy on the Yimby's side, and they have already achieved a kind of breadth of a coalition that includes a lot of the left, includes a lot of kind of moderate centrist Democrats, and includes a lot of the left flank of the party, where they kind of drag Zoran along to conceding, at least rhetorically. We'll see how it pans out. But he went on, I think it was Derek Thompson's podcast, the Abundance Guys, was one of them, talking about how, actually we are going to, repeal, or at least liberalize the kind of housing market and allow more construction and that kind of thing. And we're seeing Democrats defending free trade in a way that would have been shocking, even 20 years ago. And it's going to have to, part of that is it's going to have to be kind of leavened with more acceptance of the premise of having a kind of social safety net you can find this in Hayek, you can find this in Friedman. Like this is even kind of traditional free market doctrinaire people would concede that, and so that's going to be kind of part of the deal. Like with the left, we're kind of from market liberals to progressives, like we're kind of talking about feeling each other out and coming to some kind of shared, not exactly consensus. We'll still have our fights, but there's a give and take there. Another example I would point to, actually, this is a really telling example, and it's related to housing, but it's bigger than that, is what just happened in California with CEQA, CEQA, the kind of Naderite environmental review law that has been terribly abused by anti-housing NIMBYs is one example. Also in trying to build energy projects and trying to build rail and commuter transit and all these things that folks on the left are coming around to wanting. Like they recognized that this ostensibly environmentalist law from the 70s or whenever it was passed has really backfired. And so you won't see Gavin Newsom and the Democrats in the California legislature running around saying, look at us, we did a massive deregulation. But that's in fact what they did in a very good market liberal oriented kind of way. So I think we're going to see that. And on our end, it will require accepting that that's not necessarily going to be cast in the kind of right-wing free market language we're used to talking about those things in. But that doesn't mean there's not real improvement and real movement in our direction on economic issues on the, broadly speaking, American left.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Reimagining Liberty. If you'd like to listen to future episodes free of ads and sponsorships, you can become a supporter for just a few dollars a month. Head to www.aaronrosspowell.com to learn more.